Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the long-awaited sophomore album from the Avalanches called Wildflower. But first, let's talk a little bit about sampling. Now, if you've been listening to hip-hop or really mainstream music at all over the course of the past 20 years, you're well aware of this. Taking a piece of music or sound and using it to build a different song, often warping it or flipping into something brand new in the process. But let's take it a step further, because normally when a hip-hop producer samples something, he adds to it with backbeats and a rapper to flow over top of it. The sample is not the only part of that composition. So enter plunderphonics, a fantastic word that describes a narrow subgenre of music where the compositions are entirely composed of samples merged and twisted together so that the fragments barely resemble the original piece and come together for a brand new whole. And what's all the more surprising is that there's often so many samples in these compositions that many are often left unclear, which can lead to a legal nightmare. It's the big reason you don't really see that many plunderphonic records these days. Or when we do see them, the samples are often innocuous, from out-of-print videos or music from decades past, long forgotten by everybody else. Now this takes us to the Avalanches, an Australian electronic group who released a plunderphonic record in 2000 called Since I Left You that would become critically acclaimed for its fusion of samples into a cinematic, world-crossing retro disco experience. Now going back to re-listen to that album, yeah, for sure it's very good, that demands a lot of attention, but I wouldn't quite say I loved it. I appreciate the emotive scope and the real earnest power, but it does have some moments that kind of drag, and you would like to think that the Avalanches would have a little bit more ambition in its final project and make more than just string section disco, to paraphrase Robert Christgau. And yet, from that point, it has taken 16 years to follow it up with a new album called Wildflower, which is reportedly created to thematically recapture the euphoric feeling of summer road trips, mostly pushed through 60s psychedelic pop. Okay, it's a bit of a smaller scale for the themes, but yeah, I was definitely intrigued. So, did the Avalanches manage to deliver? Well, okay. To explain my full thoughts around this album, you should all know some context about me, and that one of my favorite albums of all time is Brian Wilson's Smile, a passion project that many thought that he would never finish, but was eventually released in 2004 to rave reviews that it deserved beyond all measure. That album is incredible. It is a pure pop album too, touched with psychedelia and Americana with its conceptual road trip across the United States, but never quite compromising that childlike, borderline cartoonish optimism that Wilson made mean so much more. I say all that because Wildflower reminded me a lot of Smile with every listen, at least on the surface with some of the goofier textures and the moments of raw optimism that seem kind of tempered with a deeper sadness that comes with chasing dreams that your heart will not let go of. And yet, I don't think Wildflower pulls it off. It's definitely on the cusp of it, so close to capturing that magic, but it only gets there in snippets. Some transcendent moments that unfortunately render much of the material around it so much retro kitsch. And look, you're not gonna find more of an easy audience for that sort of retro kitsch than me, but this could have been magical. It could have been transcendent instead of just very good. It's just a shade away from pure greatness, and I have to admit, that's kind of disappointing. And to explain all that, the first thing that needs to be noted is that this is not a pure plunderphonics record. Rap verses were specifically recorded from it from Danny Brown, Markie, Camp Low, AD+, and even MF Doom himself. Plus there are some added backing vocals from Tori E. Moy, Jonathan Donahue of Mercury Rev, Father John Misty, and even Ariel Pink. Although good luck hearing the latter two of them, as their voices are nearly buried within the swirling melodies and fidelities of this album. But the sample-heavy nature remains here, if anything going older than the retro disco of Since I Left You to the psychedelic pop of the 60s and early 70s. With a fair few obvious Beatles samples to boot. No wonder this album took so long to get cleared. And look, I admire the hell out of plunderphonics music, where the process and ability to fuse so many disparate elements together to make a new whole elevates the final work, which is why such obvious sampling can feel a little bit distracting. Oh, don't get me wrong, the flow on Frankie Sinatra of Danny Brown into MF Doom to a sample of my favorite things from The Sound of Music, it's a great early high point on this album, especially all set against an instrumental interpolated from Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite by the Beatles. All that is awesome, but setting the bar that high only places lower points in this album with sharper comparison. Similar thing with the goofy chomping of the Noisy Eater with National Treasure Biz Markie, and with samples from Come Together by the Beatles. It's garish and kooky with the horns, the bass drum, the beatboxing, the bombastic strings, and even the theremin, but that sets a bar of outlandish energy and flair that most of this album struggles to recapture, particularly in the more psychedelic folk tracks. I'm gonna go against critical consensus glance and say all the hip-hop segments were nearly all absolutely awesome. Between Danny Brown's manic energy, Camp Lo's New York swagger, and MF Doom's twisted flow, they helped ground this album in a way that it desperately needed. Now, you might initially wonder why this album might need any sort of grounding. Hell, very early on, it can hold the balance between cartoonish flair and deeper pathos pretty effectively, even if I'm not always wild about how the songs can't keep a consistent fidelity of sampling. Because I'm Me is a feel of a forgotten classic of New York hip-hop, and how it breaks into the grimier Frankie Sinatra and the slightly more futuristic disco sparks of Subways impressively grabs the atmosphere, even if the usage of child choruses repeatedly goes right to the line of kitsch. And when the slightly flat synth tone plays against the chimes, flute, and sounds of traffic that fades into the sandy psychedelia If I Was a Folkstar from Tori E. Moy, I was on board. Where this album started to lose itself for me was Jonathan Donahue's crooning over colors, complete with inverted samples, compression, and an LSD-soaked backdrop. Not that it was bad, but I got the feeling that it was headed towards the airheaded hippie meandering that tends to be kind of hit and miss for me. Sure, the Noisy Eater deflected from that, and I dug the spacey flourishes on the title track interlude, but then we have Harmony, which quite literally contains a sample from Sesame Street, where the richer vocal harmonies and sleigh bells actually managed to just transcend being too saccharine for its own damn good. And then, right after Paris Pursuan's rap verse, the record just settles into an extended lull that desperately needs the sort of spark or shift in mood that Frontier Psychiatrist brought to Since I Left You. Sure, I was thrilled to see Danny Brown again on the Wazard of Is that goes against glassy fragments, heavy drums, and an alien voice displaying magic and demanding surrender, but then the track gets lost in its own compression in the Shondell sample that didn't really click with the rest of the song. And along with the sandy acoustics and the banjo on Park Music, the clunky, easy listening warbling on Sunshine that got incredibly annoying in a hurry, and the glassy wonkiness of Kaleidoscopic Lovers, this album only really breaks free of that lull for me with Step Kids, where I might not have liked Jennifer Horemna's vocals, and that you could barely hear Warren Ellis's violin, but the lyrics at least try to bring things back to earth and ground the record again. And that's something that needs to be highlighted here. If you can follow the sound effects, the radio snippets, and fragments of conversation between the psychedelic meandering, this is indeed a road trip album, from the subways of New York to the beaches along the coast, all of which seem to culminate in a spoken word piece from David Berman at the end of the album on Saturday Night Inside Out, which seems to imply a long-lost reconnection that might be fleeting but inspires so much more that I wish the music could remotely pay off. Sure, with the liquid guitars and the chimes and the sandy percussion as the ebbing, stuttering tides of lo-fi melody, it has the mark of a good Ariel Pink-esque dramatic climax, and yet it doesn't stick the landing, instead fading off into a long 20 seconds of silence with nothing to really bring it all together for the album as a whole. And that kind of undercuts the dramatic impact for me. For as much as there are some grounding, more gritty moments, there's an element of wistfulness that only comes through sporadically that this album desperately needed all the way through to transcend the kitsch of it all. It just has so much light, flighty material that needs to get weighed down by something to hold it all together, add some weight and dramatic pathos. But look, please take this review with a grain of salt, because I desperately wanted to love this album. There are points that were always going to hold me back from completely embracing it. The seams of the Plunderphonics formula tend to bug me a bit, because even despite some great transitions, the fidelity and compression shifts did kind of get on my nerves. But this album could have transcended that if it had a little bit more grit and dramatic momentum and weight. And sure, parts of Since I Left You had similar issues in terms of the stakes, but you got the feeling that the glitz was overshadowing a deeper heartbreak and connection on that album that had real pathos. Whereas here, it was just more ephemeral, and that meant it didn't quite connect as well for me. As such, while I'm giving this a very strong 7 out of 10, I definitely encourage you all to check this out. It's a sort of rare release that definitely deserves a lot of attention, and there really are some transcendent moments that I found incredibly enjoyable. And again, if you have more tolerance for 70s kitsch and cheesiness, you're probably gonna adore this. And hell, if it took the Avalanches 16 years to make it, I'd argue for the most part, it was pretty much worth the wait. So check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here, so I'm actually curious how many of you probably adore this album. I got a fair number of requests for it, so I'm curious. Do you guys think it managed to work all the way through? Do you think it was better than Since I Left You? I just think it's a shade weaker. It doesn't quite come together for me. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.